Harrison Ford has always been known as one of Hollywood's most serious and disciplined actors. For decades, audiences saw him as the calm hero, the man who rarely raised his voice but commanded attention the moment he walked into a scene. From Han Solo to Indiana Jones, Ford built a career on quiet strength, intelligence, and emotional control. But behind that calm image was a man who cared deeply about storytelling, respect, and professionalism. He did not enjoy Hollywood politics, but he took his work very seriously. Over the years, many actors passed through his orbit without incident. But a few relationships became strained, not because of gossip or scandals, but because of clashing values. One of the most famous examples of this happened in the late 1990s, when Harrison Ford and Brad Pitt worked together on the film The Devil's Own. At the time, Ford was already a legend with decades of success behind him. Brad Pitt, on the other hand, was younger, ambitious, and rapidly becoming one of the most powerful stars of his generation. The project was meant to bring together two different eras of Hollywood leading men, but instead, it revealed how difficult collaboration can be when two strong creative visions collide. Brad Pitt had been attached to The Devil's Own from an early stage and felt deeply connected to the story. He wanted the film to explore moral complexity rather than clear heroes and villains. His character, an IRA member hiding in America, was written as conflicted, emotional, and morally unclear. Pitt believed this complexity was the heart of the film. When Harrison Ford joined the project, he saw potential, but also imbalance. Ford felt his character, a police officer, lacked emotional depth and internal struggle. To him, the story felt uneven. He believed that, without complexity on both sides, the film would fail to feel real. Ford pushed for rewrites, not to dominate the story, but to make it stronger in his view. However, from Pitt's perspective, these changes felt like a threat to the original vision. He worried that the film was slowly being reshaped around Ford rather than the story they initially agreed upon. As production continued, the tension between the two actors grew quietly but steadily. Script meetings became tense. Rewrites piled up. Crew members later described the set as uncomfortable, not because of open arguments, but because of constant creative disagreement. Pitt wanted to protect the emotional core of his character. Ford wanted balance and maturity in the storytelling. Neither actor believed he was wrong. This kind of conflict is common in Hollywood, but what made it different was how deeply both men believed in their positions. The situation reached a breaking point when Brad Pitt publicly criticized the film before its release, calling it irresponsible in an interview. For Harrison Ford, this was unacceptable. He believed that once a film is finished, actors have a responsibility to stand behind it, regardless of personal disagreements. Public criticism, in his eyes, was a betrayal of the entire crew who worked on the project. Ford was deeply offended, not just as an actor, but as a professional. After that moment, the relationship between Ford and Pitt never recovered. Although they appeared together during promotions, their interactions were polite and distant. There was no warmth, no camaraderie, only obligation. The film itself performed moderately, but the emotional cost was high. They never worked together again. Over time, Ford acknowledged Pitt's talent, but made it clear they never shared the same creative vision. Pitt chose not to speak publicly about the conflict afterward. What remained was silence. In Hollywood terms, that silence spoke volumes. This was not a feud filled with shouting or public insults, but a quiet separation rooted in disappointment and broken trust. It showed how even the biggest stars can struggle to work together when values and expectations clash. For Harrison Ford, this experience reinforced his belief that respect and loyalty matter more than ego, even in an industry built on fame. If the conflict with Brad Pitt was about creative control, the situation with Shia LaBeouf cut much deeper on an emotional level. Indiana Jones was not just another role for Harrison Ford. It was the character most closely tied to his identity and legacy. When Steven Spielberg decided to revive the franchise in 2008 with Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, Ford was genuinely excited. After nearly 2 decades, he was returning to a role that defined generations. When Shia LaBeouf was cast as Mutt Williams, Indiana Jones' son, Ford welcomed him warmly. On set, early interactions between the two were positive. Shia looked up to Ford with admiration, often asking about his experiences on the original films. Ford responded kindly, offering advice and encouragement. To many on set, it felt like a real father and son relationship forming naturally. However, as filming progressed, differences in personality and working style began to surface. Harrison Ford approached acting with discipline, quiet focus, and efficiency. He believed in preparation and precision. Shia LaBeouf, on the other hand, was energetic, expressive, and deeply emotional about his work. He questioned scenes, discussed motivations openly, and sometimes struggled under the pressure of carrying such an iconic legacy. These differences did not lead to open arguments, but they created tension. Crew members later recalled that Ford disliked unnecessary noise and distraction, while Shia thrived on conversation and exploration. The generational gap between them became impossible to ignore. The real damage occurred after the film's release. Although Crystal Skull was a box office success, it received mixed reviews from critics. In interviews, Shia openly expressed disappointment with the film, stating that he felt he had let fans down. He spoke honestly about his struggles with the role and his dissatisfaction with the final product. To Shia, this was self-reflection. To Harrison Ford, it was betrayal. Ford believed that criticizing the film publicly was disrespectful to the hundreds of people who worked hard to make it. In later interviews, Ford responded sharply, stating that actors should support their films, not tear them apart. His words were harsh, and they clearly hurt Shia deeply. From that point forward, the relationship was effectively over. Shia's character was written out of the franchise, and when Ford returned for Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, Mutt Williams was gone. His story closed off-screen. Spielberg, who had been close to both actors, chose not to comment publicly. But the silence was telling. Shia's career soon entered a turbulent period, marked by legal troubles, personal struggles, and public controversies. While these events were not caused by Ford, the loss of that relationship marked a turning point. For Ford, the issue was simple. Loyalty mattered. Once broken, it could not be repaired. This situation showed another side of Harrison Ford. He was not cruel or aggressive, but he was firm. He believed in protecting the legacy of the characters he helped create. Indiana Jones represented decades of hard work, collaboration, and audience love. Public criticism felt like a personal attack on that legacy. The emotional weight of this conflict lingered long after the film ended. It was not about anger alone, but disappointment. Ford had hoped to pass the torch. Instead, the bond was broken. This story highlights how fragile relationships can be in Hollywood, especially when legacy and expectations collide. Closed studio doors, where power and decisions often matter more than emotions. In 1990, Alec Baldwin starred as Jack Ryan in The Hunt for Red October. The film was successful, and Baldwin believed he had secured a long-term role in a major franchise. He spoke proudly about the character and saw it as a defining part of his career. However, when the sequel entered development, Paramount Studios made a quiet decision. Without fully informing Baldwin, they chose to replace him with Harrison Ford for Patriot Games. From a studio perspective, Ford's star power promised higher box office returns. From Baldwin's perspective, it felt like betrayal. When Baldwin learned of the decision, he expressed frustration publicly. He felt disrespected and sidelined without proper communication. Harrison Ford, stepping into the role, viewed the situation differently. To him, this was a professional opportunity, not a personal attack. However, Ford took issue with Baldwin's public comments. He believed that airing grievances in public crossed a line. Ford valued discretion and believed that conflicts should remain private. As a result, any possibility of mutual understanding disappeared quickly. The tension between them never turned into open hostility, but it created a lasting divide. This final conflict reinforced a pattern seen throughout Ford's career. He did not engage in public feuds, social media arguments, or dramatic confrontations. Instead, he responded with distance. Once trust was broken, he moved on. This approach earned him a reputation as difficult by some, but respected by others. Ford did not chase approval. He believed in doing the work well and letting results speak for themselves. Looking back, these conflicts reveal more about Harrison Ford than about the people he clashed with. They show a man deeply committed to his craft, protective of his legacy, and unwilling to compromise on values he believed were essential. In an industry driven by ego, Ford's silence often spoke louder than words. His story is not one of hatred in the traditional sense, but of boundaries. Boundaries drawn firmly and never erased. In Hollywood, some battles are loud and public. Others are quiet and permanent. Harrison Ford's most difficult relationships belonged to the second kind. They left no screaming headlines, only unanswered questions and unfinished collaborations. And in many ways, that silence became part of his legend. In Hollywood, roles come and go, but disrespect is remembered forever. For Alec Baldwin, the role of Jack Ryan was not just another acting job. It was a promise of future stardom, a doorway into a franchise that could define his career for decades. When Baldwin starred in The Hunt for Red October, his performance was praised, and many believed he would naturally return for the sequel. But behind the scenes, something changed. Negotiations dragged on. Studios grew impatient. And while Baldwin believed talks were still open, the machine of Hollywood had already moved forward without him. Quietly, almost invisibly, the role slipped away. When the news finally reached Baldwin, it felt less like a professional decision and more like a betrayal. According to people close to him, Baldwin was shocked not only because he lost the role, but because no one had warned him. The replacement was Harrison Ford, already a legend by that time. When director John McTiernan later mentioned Baldwin's name during discussions, Ford allegedly responded with a cold and dismissive remark that would echo in Baldwin's mind for years. Whether the exact words were spoken or not almost stopped mattering. What mattered was the silence that followed. Ford offered no explanation, no courtesy call, no public acknowledgement. He simply stepped into the role, delivered a strong performance in Patriot Games, and moved on. The film was a success, and Hollywood declared the decision correct. But for Baldwin, every new poster, every trailer, felt like a reminder of something taken from him without respect. Over time, that wound hardened into resentment. Years later, Baldwin would finally speak openly in his memoir, criticizing Ford not only as an actor, but as a presence, questioning his depth and artistry. Observers noted that it was no longer about Jack Ryan. It was about pride, ego, and a feeling of being quietly erased. Ford never responded publicly. That silence only fueled Baldwin's anger further. To Ford, the matter was finished. To Baldwin, it never truly ended. This moment set the tone for what many would later recognize as a pattern in Harrison Ford's career. He did not argue publicly. He did not explain himself. When he believed a decision was right, he stood by it and cut ties without looking back. And Baldwin was far from the only person to feel the cold edge of that approach. Years earlier, during the filming of Blade Runner in 1982, Ford was already experiencing one of the most difficult productions of his life. What was meant to be a groundbreaking science fiction film became a test of endurance. Night after night, the set was soaked in artificial rain. The cold was constant. The schedule was brutal. Director Ridley Scott demanded perfection in every frame, repeating scenes endlessly until the lighting, movement, and mood matched his vision. Ford, already exhausted, began to feel less like an artist and more like a tool trapped inside a machine. He later described the experience as draining, both physically and mentally. The tension between actor and director grew heavy. Communication broke down. They often avoided speaking to each other directly. Ford questioned the logic behind certain choices. Scott, focused on visual storytelling, saw Ford's questions as resistance. Each believed the other did not fully understand the film they were trying to make together. One of the deepest frustrations for Ford was the studio-mandated voice-over narration. He felt it insulted the intelligence of the audience and weakened the mystery of the story. Forced to record lines he hated, Ford read them flatly, hoping they would be removed. They were not. By the end of filming, both men were emotionally drained. The film's initial release disappointed studios and critics, even though it would later be celebrated as a classic. But the scars of that production remained. Ford walked away, feeling coerced. Scott walked away, believing the suffering was necessary for greatness. Two men, one legendary film, and a collaboration that nearly broke them both. While the conflict between Harrison Ford and Ridley Scott shaped Blade Runner behind the camera, another tension unfolded directly in front of it. Sean Young, who played Rachel, approached her role with intense dedication. She stayed in character constantly, speaking, moving, and reacting as if she truly were a replicant, questioning her own humanity. Ridley Scott admired this commitment. Harrison Ford did not. After long nights of filming in cold rain, Ford wanted clarity, efficiency, and separation between performance and reality. Young's method blurred that line. To Ford, it felt unpredictable and exhausting. He often did not know if he was speaking to his co-star or to the character she refused to leave behind. This created discomfort that quickly turned into frustration. Crew members later described the atmosphere as tense and uneasy whenever the two were together. Scenes meant to show quiet connection instead felt stiff and distant. The famous romantic scene between Deckard and Rachel was particularly difficult. Both actors performed their roles professionally, but the emotional warmth audiences expected was missing. Later, Sean Young would claim that her experience on set was shaped by pressure and misunderstanding, suggesting that personal boundaries were crossed. These claims were never fully confirmed by others involved, but they added another layer of darkness to an already troubled production. What remains clear is that Ford wanted the film finished and behind him. He did not enjoy the process, and he did not seek reconciliation. When Blade Runner 2049 was released decades later, Ford returned, older and wearier, while Rachel appeared only as a digital recreation. There was no reunion, no shared closure. The distance remained. Years later, Harrison Ford would face a different kind of tension on the set of Hollywood Homicide in 2003. This time, the conflict was generational. Josh Hartnett, young and rising, approached acting with emotional spontaneity. Ford, experienced and disciplined, preferred control and structure. The two were forced to share long hours in confined spaces, filming scenes inside a police car, where silence often filled the air. Hartnett later admitted he did not know how to approach Ford, who appeared distant and reserved. Ford, on the other hand, reportedly found Hartnett unfocused and overly expressive. Each take became a struggle to find common rhythm. The tension was real enough that it translated onto the screen. Some critics felt the discomfort added realism. Others believed it weakened the film. Off-camera, words were exchanged through third parties rather than face-to-face. Insults were rumored, but over time, the two adapted. They learned to work together, not out of friendship, but necessity. By the end of production, the tension had cooled, replaced by professional tolerance. Still, the film failed commercially, and the experience was remembered more for its behind-the-scenes strain than its story. These repeated clashes painted a clear picture of Harrison Ford's working style. He valued preparation, control, and purpose. When those elements disappeared, his patience wore thin. He did not seek conflict, but he also did not soften himself to avoid it. To many younger actors and creative collaborators, this came across as coldness or arrogance. To Ford, it was simply discipline. And when discipline was challenged, distance followed. One of the most revealing examples of Harrison Ford's uncompromising nature never even reached the screen. At one point, Ford and Kevin Costner were attached to the same Western project, a film that many believed could become a modern classic. On paper, it was a dream collaboration. In reality, it became a silent battle of visions. Ford imagined a slow, thoughtful story focused on the inner cost of violence and isolation. Costner envisioned sweeping landscapes, heroic journeys, and grand emotional moments. Meetings became tense, not because of shouting, but because neither man was willing to yield. Scripts were revised repeatedly. Each version seemed to pull the story in a different direction. Those involved later said it felt as if two completely different films were being written under the same title. Eventually, the silence grew heavier than any argument. Ford confronted Costner directly, questioning whether the character's emotional weight truly mattered to him. Costner responded calmly but firmly, defending his epic approach. No insults were exchanged. No doors were slammed. And yet, the project collapsed. The cancellation left a lasting impact. Ford stepped away from similar Western projects, while Costner went on to create films and series that reflected his own vision, proving his commitment to the genre. They never worked together again. They never publicly discussed the fallout. Hollywood moved on, but those close to the project remembered it as a rare example of two powerful figures unwilling to compromise. When looking at Harrison Ford's long career, a pattern becomes clear. He is not driven by popularity or harmony. He is driven by clarity. When he believes in a project, he gives everything. When trust breaks down, he withdraws completely. This approach has earned him respect, but also distance. Some see him as difficult. Others see him as honest. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Ford does not chase approval. He does not smooth conflicts with charm. He stands firm, even when it costs him relationships. That is why certain rivalries never healed. Alec Baldwin never received an explanation. Ridley Scott never received an apology. Sean Young never received closure. Kevin Costner never found common ground. These were not loud Hollywood feuds filled with headlines and insults. They were quiet fractures shaped by ego, exhaustion, and vision. And that makes them even more powerful. Because in Hollywood, silence often speaks louder than words. Harrison